Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Room for Discussion. My name is Elmer, and I'll be interviewing with my great friend over here, James. And I know I'm not the first one to say that we are tremendously excited for our interview today with Dan Ariely. As many of you already know, Dan Ariely is a world-renowned behavioral economist, cognitive psychologist, and the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, predictably Irrational, The Upside of Irrationality, and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. We'll hope to take a number of these concepts in these books and apply it throughout our discussion.
But before we start our interview, we actually have some questions for you. So, by show of hands, who here thinks or would think that they are rational?
Wow.
No, okay, it's definitely more irrational. Okay. And second question, who here thinks that they're searching for some sort of meaning in their life? Yeah, I think
a lot
everyone.
more.
Yeah, not Mr. Ariely, he's found it. And last question, who here is worried about our generation's future? Okay, interesting.
That's better.
Well, these are all the sorts of things that we're going to be discussing over the next hour. We've already started asking our questions. Of course, there will be time for you to ask yours during the interview. But for now, please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our guest, Mr. Dan Ariely.
Thank you.
Mr. Ariely, welcome to Room for Discussion.
Dan.
Dan?
Yeah.
Do you believe in free will?
So no. I think, it's not that we have zero free will, right? If you said, do we have 100% free will, the answer is no. But it sounds like bad news, but it's really not, because one of the main lessons from behavioral economics and social science in general is the environment matters, right? So imagine I came to you every morning before you woke up with a tray of fresh croissants and muffins.
I'd like that.
Well, would you? What are the odds? What are the odds that by the end of the year you would be as healthy?
Yeah, not high.
Not high. Right. So if you lived in that environment that basically tempted you all the time with cookies and croissants, you will fail. Not every day, but you will fail often. And a human freedom, if you think about it, in my perspective, is not about the ability to resist a cookie when you see it. It's about designing an environment where you don't face these temptations. So let's think about redesigning a refrigerator or redesigning supermarkets. The moment we design those things with a better way, that's where our free will comes. We get to design the world. But once we design it a certain way, people will fail. So, they asked you a few questions, I'll ask you another one. How many of you think that you check your phone more frequently than is good for your long-term psychological well-being? We all do, right? Here's a bad design. Now the phone comes with notifications, and the default for notification is to be turned on. I usually keep my phone with all notifications off. It's on do not disturb mode all the time. But we all know that it's the right thing to do, to turn off notification in the long term, but we don't. So it's really for me a question of what kind of environment do we want to build? And if we will build some environments, we would end up having a healthier life, and if we'll build something else, it will be very different. I'll give you another small example for this. There's a phenomena called the pain of paying, the agony of payment. And here's an example. Imagine that tonight you're going to dinner. Imagine it's an expensive meal. It's 50 euros. And you can either pay with cash or with credit card. Which one of those would feel worse? The cash would feel worse. Why would the cash feel worse? Because it turns out that when we pay and consume at the same time, we feel worse about it. So imagine I owned a restaurant and I figured out that people on average eat 50 bites and pay 50 euros. And I came to you and I said that because you're such wonderful people, I'll give you a discount. I'll charge you half a euro per bite, right? Regular people pay euro per bite. I'll charge you half a euro per bite. And not only that, I'll charge you only for the bites you eat. The bites you don't eat, you don't need to pay. how much fun will that meal be? I'll serve you your dish, I'll sit back, every time you take a bite, I'll mark it on my little notebook. How much fun will that meal be? Not that much fun. When I teach sometimes about the psychology of money, I bring pizza to class, and I charge my students 25 cents per bite. What do you think happens? Huge bites. Huge bites. And you would think they would take one big bite, they would realize it's not that much fun, and no, but they stand there with the pizza and they're so tempted to push a little bit more in to make it more efficient. Now, this is credit card versus cash, the pain of paying. Do we want to dial it up or dial it down? If we dial the pain of paying up, people would spend less and save more. We dial it down, people would spend more and save less. And small things really matter. So we said credit card versus cash. Imagine that you have a credit card and you want to spend 1,000 euros a month on discretionary spending. What are the odds that if you only use a credit card, you'll adhere to your budget? Not very high. What if we gave you a prepaid debit card? Much better. What would happen if the prepaid debit card would not give you the budget for a month, 1,000 euros, but will give you 250 euros per week? Better or worse? Better, right? Because on a week we can see better. And when is it better to load the debit card? To load it up with money on Monday or on Friday? What do you think? Monday, because if you load it on Friday, the weekend shows up and then people overspend if you do it on Monday. So small things like this matter, and we need to start thinking about how do we design the world around us to be compatible with how we're thinking. So that's where I think we have free will.
Yeah, I want to go back to that phone example because I recently spent 40 euros on a self-locking cookie jar in order to put my phone in it so I couldn't access it. And I'm wondering because it just shows the highly addictive potential of these businesses anyways.
Which one did you get?
K-Safe.
K-Safe.
Do you know it? It was on Shark Tank.
Yeah. They were my students.
Really?
Yeah.
No way.
Oh, good idea, honestly. Tell them thank you for that. Seriously, I wasn't on my phone this morning. It felt fantastic. But I do want to ask about this because where does this kind of leave consumer free will? Because these things are getting highly, highly predictive and very highly addictive.
Yeah. So, we look, in many ways, the capitalistic system is a competitive system where every entity is fighting for our time, money, and attention. Right? So you imagine you walk down the street and everybody wants a piece of you. Every coffee shop wants you to buy another cookie, and every app wants you to spend more time. Everybody wants something from you. Who actually thinks about your long-term well-being?
Not the businesses.
No.
Well, hopefully your mother,
Well,
maybe.
That's true.
You can think, maybe close family, maybe religion, maybe the government. I mean, but most of the entities around us have a very different goal, right? So, we're not in a natural environment where there are trees and, it's like they have their own goal and so on. We have other players in our environment that their benefit can sometimes be against our best interest.
But what can we do about that?
So we need to design tools like things that help us control it. We need to first understand the damage, right? So we first need to understand the damage of notifications. We first need to understand the damage of cookies. We first need to understand the damage, and then we need to develop mechanism for self-control. And the mechanism are not going to be the mechanism that say to people, resist. That's not going to work. The mechanisms have to be much more complex. And then, of course, the other thing to do is to think about regulation, right? What kind of things do we regulate? And we regulate lots of things, right? Like driving, we regulate a lot. Illegal drugs, we regulate a lot. But there's lots of things that we don't, the government doesn't have the will to regulate, and then we have to create mechanisms to empower people for self-regulation.
And so this is about kind of structures determining or manipulating our behavior, hopefully for the good. But what has a bigger effect? I mean, you as a psychologist predict behavior. That's part of your role. And so what do you think has a bigger effect on our behavior? Is it the structure that we're in, or is it our individual nature?
So much more can be described by the structure, by,
But it-
by the environment than by personality. So personality is a nice contract, and we each feel that we have a very different personality. But the reality is that the environment determines much more of our behavior. If you think about this ability of personality purely to predict behavior, it has a very weak ability to predict. And it's not because we don't have a personality, we have tendencies, but the environment really overwhelms it. So,
But in your work, have you found what are the kind of psychological axioms of human behavior, the bedrock that we can really count on and you can say that this is common to humanity and to human nature?
so I think, things like the environment matters a great deal. It's
That's
true for
the
Axiom in
everybody.
itself.
I see.
If you're looking for individual traits, I think that the most powerful one is probably grit, or the ability to resist temptation, and that's something that people develop and can develop, and some people have a higher quantity of that, and it helps them avoid temptation in all kinds of things. But even that maybe explains 30% of the.
And can we use structures to develop grit?
So yes, but not in the way that you think.
Okay.
So if you think about the original results of Walter Mischel, it's really hard to get people to look at something tempting like a cookie and not care. The Dalai Lama, I'm sure he can do it, right? But it's a lot of work and very hard to get to it. But what we can teach people is, for example, to sit on their hands, right? So you can't take this, or to turn around, or to distract themselves. So the things that, if you look at Walter Mischel's work, the things that we could teach people are the tricks not to be tempted, rather than the ability to take true temptation and fight it.
Okay.
But what about cheating? Because you've mentioned in the past as well that human beings, I would say it's a biological component, that humans cheat a little bit, and you made an analogy to the financial crisis, which I know is a wide step to take, but in these instances, do you think the biological propensity to cheat has a larger influence than the actual structures that we find ourselves in place of?
It's a great example, and no. So what we find is that almost everybody has the ability to cheat a little bit and tell ourselves stories about why this is actually okay.
The rationalization
That's
of
right.
our
That's right.
dishonesty.
Rationalization, by the way, is fantastic human skill. You can count on it. We're very good at that. So we have this ability to cheat a little bit and rationalize what it is. And then the second thing we can do is that we have a slippery slope. So once we start telling a story, it's easier to tell better and better stories and to rationalize better cheating. But now, if you think about it, what is the environment contributing to our ability to tell little stories and to rationalize and to tell stories? A lot. So what are some stories that we tell ourselves? We tell ourselves stories like everybody else is doing it. Or we tell ourselves stories where we say we're maximizing shareholder value.
You look good in that dress.
It's what?
Or you look good in that dress.
Or this is socially acceptable. So there are things like that we have a tendency, but the environment gets it to be expressed in very, very different ways, right? So if you think about, 1,000 years ago, people probably had the same tendency to, say, honey, how do I look in that dress, let's say.
Yeah.
But the implication was not as high. When you have a banking system where you can manipulate the LIBOR interest rates, and all of a sudden it can destroy the whole economy, the activities are still small, but the amplification is much higher. And that's one of the things that is so important. If you think about, as people, we don't have capacity for much attention or split attention. Until we had phones and cars at the same hands, it wasn't that dangerous. But we're building society, and we're putting a lot of pressure on our ability. Like, think about driving. Okay, how many of you make at least one typing mistake per page when you type? Okay, we make lots of mistakes. I mean, that's just the truth of it. We make lots of mistakes, and all of a sudden you take something like driving, when you say the cost of a little mistake could be tremendous. So what we're doing is we're creating a system, or not taking immunization. Lots of things are basically putting more and more demand on our ability to make good decisions. That's dangerous.
Because we do want to talk more about building and constructing society actually in a few minutes, but first, before we do that, what do you mean to say when humans are rational? Because you hinted at it a bit before, long-term versus short-term, but a more precise definition?
What do I mean by irrational?
By rational. So what makes a
Okay.
human rational?
Because we like to think that we're rational. I mean, you've just given loads of examples of how we're not, but
Yeah.
we would, even the people raising their hands at the start
Yeah.
of the interview.
So there's all kinds of different definitions of rational. I don't think anybody truly means that. Even the people who raise their hands, for example,
You're wrong.
a rational, for example, a rational actor should have no emotions, right? It should all be about cost and benefit. A rational actor should never give money to charity. A rational actor should never give a tip to a waiter in a restaurant that you don't intend to go back to that restaurant. I mean, rational actors are really quite awful people, if you think about this, right? You certainly don't want to marry somebody like that. But there's kind of there's kind of two versions of rationality, and both of them are important. The first version is what economists mean. And what economists mean by rationality is that we know our preferences, and we're transitive, right? And you can show in all kinds of ways in which that doesn't work. And the reason I care about this definition is that that's a definition that fuels a lot of policy decisions, right? So economics, unlike other social science disciplines, is both descriptive and prescriptive, right? So history is descriptive, sociology is descriptive, psychology is descriptive. Economics is also prescriptive. It's come to policymakers and says, here is what you should be doing. Now, that's a very courageous step. And that's my complaint with economists, right? Because if we build a healthcare system based on assumption for rationality, I'm not sure that that's the healthcare system I want to create. If we build an education system based on that, I don't know. So the prescriptive side is fine, because if you have a descriptive theory that is 25% accurate, that's great. It's a perspective, it's insight, and so on. The moment you say, I know everything, listen to me, just do tax system this way, now we have a problem. So that's one definition. And the second definition is whether we understand what's driving our behavior. And that's a also important definition, because if we don't understand what drives our behavior, it's where we could fail. So think about something like human generosity. Most people recognize, yes, we give money to strangers in the streets. We see somebody falling, our heart goes to them and we want to help them. That violates the standard rule of rationality, but it doesn't violate the second one, because people have a good intuition about it. So yes, I do care about other people, and indeed, we do care about other people. But in that world, that we don't understand what drives our behavior, that's where we could all make mistakes, right? If you don't understand what caused you to fall in love, what caused you to fall out of love, if you don't understand what motivates us, if you don't understand what motivates employees, what gets people to hate each other. I mean, if you don't understand all of those things, we're not going to be able to predict our own behavior or improve the behavior of others.
And I think a large part of predicting that behavior, and probably why we're getting better at it, is a question of data. And specifically, I want to talk about big data. And it's got a rational paradigm in that you're collecting inputs, you're collecting data to lead to the best possible output. However, there is a kind of Orwellian dystopia risk, I think, with big data. For example, predicting criminal behavior. The idea that you can take these inputs from this person and predict a criminal act before it's even happened. And is this kind of a risk you see with using structures and using data to kind of manipulate, predict, foresee human behavior?
So first of all, let me say something about big data before we move to the
there's
your
a lot to
fears.
unpack, yeah.
I actually worry that people put too much hope on big data and not enough on experiments. And big data and experiments are very different from each other. So let's say that the average age in this room is 25. All of you have been sleeping for many years. You should all be experts in sleeping. How many of you truly think you understand sleep? You understand when you sleep better, when you sleep worse, what the consequences are. The odds are very low that any of you, even if you think you are, the odds are very low. Because it's not enough to have big data. Even if I gave you a hard drive with all your sleep data for all the years that you've been alive, and I gave you a good statistical software, maybe some statistical help, you're not going to learn a lot. Why? Because you've mostly been trying to sleep in the same way over and over and over, and you haven't really tried enough variation. Right? The notion of big data usually says that the right answer is already, somebody has discovered the right answer, like somebody has it correct, or at least many people have it correct, right? In many things in life, the correct answer is not in the set. So if you do a big data exercise, I might be able to figure out maybe the one or two people here who know something about sleep, and maybe what you do. But it turns out, for example, that sleeping in low temperature really helps, accelerating REM sleep. It turns out that not drinking coffee after 4 helps, lavender smell helps, I mean, lots of things help. Plus, we have cell phones. Cell phones are like the last 10 years. So if I looked at all data, new things are happening. So, and you know, blue light and so on. So, so I think that one of the things we need to do is to not to rely just on big data, but to keep on experimenting. And for me, experiments are about imagining a different future, putting it into action in a small way, and testing whether this future can actually be better.
But that's coming from a psychologist's perspective. So businesses, for example, do use big data. They can, increasingly they can use it to predict customer sentiment and customer behavior.
But even businesses can try to create a different future. So again, when you do big data, you say, given my current system, what's the best thing? But experiments, no matter who is using them, is saying, my current set is not reflecting anything. There's more things to do. And I want to simulate that other future. So that's the first answer. Like big data, really nice, but sometimes it comes at the expense of experiments, which I think are different and could be more important. Not for things like speech recognition, but for things that we can invent a new reality. Like with speech, we finished designing speech. We have it. In terms of the question of who owns the data, what we can predict from this.
Yeah, and it's just about this extreme ability to predict, kind of infringing on some sense of autonomy or some sense of the individual.
Yeah. So there's not going to be a simple answer here. And the reason is that, if you're a standard economist, you have a really deep respect for individuals. You say people can make the right decisions, we just give them more data, people can make the right decisions. When you're somebody like me, you think, no, people are myopic, vindictive, emotional, can't think to the long term, and they need help. So it means all kinds of things. I'll describe to you one experiment we did. So in this experiment, we created a Tamagotchi. You know the Tamagotchi? It was a little turtle on a screen, and the turtle was happy as long as people exercised, took the medication, and ate well. And we knew exercise from the phone, we knew taking medication from an internet-enabled pillbox, and we knew what people were eating. They were taking pictures of their food, and a dietitian was scoring it. And the turtle was happy as long as people were doing well, and became less and less happy. Okay, that's great. And then we were hoping that people would care about the turtle, and therefore behave well. How big of the effect do you think it was? How much did people care about the turtle? Not much. Not much. And tiny. It was tiny. It was tiny. I mean, it was good, right? People cared a little bit. And, we gave people permission to name their turtle, all kinds of things. And, it had a small effect, but not enough to really drive a substantial difference on behavior. So the next thing we did was we gave our turtle superpowers. And the superpowers we gave the turtle was the ability to delete other apps from the phone. Right? So when you install the turtle, it analyzes what apps people use, and then the most popular one go out the first, the more frequent one go out the first, and the apps came back every night, and every day you could lose them again, and we're only giving it right now to people who had heart surgery. So we go to people who had heart surgery, and we say, you know, you think to yourself that you'll go home and you'll eat well and exercise and take your medication, but we know that that's not going to happen. It will last for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then you'll forget about this, and you'll misbehave, and you'll be back here for another heart surgery, or maybe you'll die. So why don't you let us install this turtle on your phone, and you could never delete the turtle, but the turtle will delete all these other apps and so on. It will help you behave well. And almost everybody says yes, and it actually helps. And because these are very sick people, we can show that it changes mortality, right? Because people do die from heart problems very, very quickly. Now, this is a question of paternalism, right? And it's a question of, you know, we can predict some things, and this is a true infringement on people's freedom. I'm not taking it lightly.
About that?
First of all, it's an experiment, right? So for experiments, I'm willing to do things that even because I want to know what the benefit is before I decide, right? If the benefit was not high, but we certainly need to weigh freedom versus dying, and you know this idea that people should be free to do what they want, including dying. I'm not sure that's right, because I don't think that the people who are, let's say we caught somebody 10 minutes before they died from a heart attack, and we say, hey, 3 years ago, should we have installed that app on your phone? My guess is they would have said yes. So we, you know, again, if you believe that people are rational, that you have no problem. If you believe that people are irrational, make lots of mistakes, now the question is, in which mistakes should you intervene? And I think that when the mistakes are big, when people don't know in advance what the size of the mistake will be, when it's things that are very hard for people to change their mind. Like, you know, it's not as if like, you know, if you don't do homework one day, you'll learn that it wasn't a good idea. If you get a heart attack, it's a little hard to go back or you don't save for retirement or something like that. So as decisions get bigger, the cost becomes larger. The asymmetry of information becomes larger. I'm more and more willing to be paternalistic, including warning people against some things that could happen to them.
And especially if there could be a balance, I guess, in helping people help themselves. But they, with the Tamagotchi example, they take the decision to help their future self, and so
That's right.
it decreases the paternalism.
That's right, and that decreases it a little bit, but you're not really solving the philosophical problem, right? You could say anybody who we think is 3 years away from a heart attack is getting this Tamagotchi. Like we could decide that that's the case, right? And so I don't know what's the right answer, but I do think we need to have a value on human freedom, but we also have to have a value on
practical
human life
outcome.
and quality of life, and somehow manage a way to do that. And you know, in the same way that we're not regulating cookies, right? We need to think about what's on the other side of that. So cigarettes, right? Tremendous amount of regulation on cigarettes, but there's lots of damaging things that we let people consume and create damage for themselves, and we don't seem to have the same care. What's on the other side of that?
Right. I guess it's a inherently normative discussion, which makes it harder.
Thankfully, I'm not a philosopher.
No,
I
you
just
chose the
collect
right
data.
profession.
Before we go to the next section, let's turn to the audience for a question. I see right there in the long blacks. Yeah, stand up.
Okay, so I have sorry, the bottom?
We always have trouble with it.
Okay, so you mentioned paternalism, and well, this obviously leads to libertarian paternalism. And Taleb wrote a lot about it, about the freedom to choose, and that you should nudge for the good. But we know that these psychological nudging effects have been around for decades. right? It's been in marketing. Totalitarian regimes have used various forms, various concepts that underlie frequent nudges that are used today. Now behavioral economics is becoming mainstream. This information is becoming more and more available. We have seen it in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It's not always as clear-cut and ethical as choosing versus dying, right? And we've seen that big data, at least in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, has had an effect on people's behavior. It has predicted voting preferences. So I always wonder how you treat the question of responsibility when it comes to these effects. Because, for example, in the Cambridge Analytica case, there was a lab in Cambridge that developed this personality test, right? The information got out somehow. Now, like the cat is out of the box. These effects are widespread. They are influencing elections. So I have two questions. Who do you think should be responsible for this? And second, do you think enough is being done to educate the public about the effects of behavioral economics and behavioral insights? Because now we're at university, we are all kind of aware about this, right? But what about the general public?
Yeah.
Big question.
Actually, lots of questions. The first thing I want to just point out is the issue with nudges, right? So nudges have become very popular. And nudges were very useful for behavioral economics in the beginning because the notion of Cass and Dick were to do something that doesn't seem offensive. So they said, let's libertarian paternalism, it's not too big, it's just nudges, it's just small things. The reality is that to move things in society, nudges are not going to be enough. If you think about, can we fight global warming with nudges? The answer is no. Right? Can we get people who had a heart attack not to have a second one? The answer is no. So we need, it was good in the beginning, right, to get it into the dialogue, but it's certainly not enough. We need to be much more intervene in a much deeper way if we want to change behavior. So that's make your second or your questions more complex, even. In terms of how you think about the ethics of that, ethics is really like it's like a diet. It's something that you have to think about all the time, and it's very complex, and we're never going to solve it. And I can tell you, I have my own ethical challenges, including the Tamagotchi, the turtle. Or here's another one. I got a call from a very big cigarette company, and they asked me to come and do a workshop for them.
Did you do it?
Wait, like have patience, like it's a story. and they offered me a lot of money, and I called the American Cancer Society, and I said, look, I got this invitation, here's how much money they offered me. If you want, I'll go and I'll give you the money to the American Cancer Society. What do you think they told me? They said to go, but I decided not to go anyway, because I didn't think they appreciate how much damage social science could cause. So there's lots of ethical questions all the time, and I can only tell you that with my students, we try to think a lot about those things and make sure we are clear that we're on the right side of ethics. But it is tough, and it's there all the time, and not just for academics, for everybody. And knowledge could be a two-edged sword, right? We're discovering something that we can use for good. Somebody else can use it for something negative. Can we prevent them from using it negative? No. We also don't have to help them. So it's always going to be complex. In terms of educating the public, I don't think that's, let's say if we could do it, I don't think it would really help. The sad reality about education is that education has a very hard time to penetrate our daily thinking. So let's say I told you something about the compromise effect or the asymmetric dominance or something like that, and I would tell you how it shows up in how you buy coffee and how you order in restaurants. You'll forget about it in 2 hours, and most of your coffee buying behavior will not be affected. That's true in lots of educational effect. For example, in the US, we spend about $700 million a year teaching people what's called financial literacy. how to deal with money, and people remember some of the facts, but they don't act differently. The improvement in how people act is about 0.1%. It's because knowing something and acting on it all the time is not the same. So I think the solution is not to make it publicly available. I don't think that will make a big enough difference, but it only means that our responsibility is much, much higher. You know, if we assume that people know about it and so on, we don't need to worry, that's not true. We do need to worry about our morality. And you know, it's like almost every invention can be used for good and bad. It's up to us.
I think we need to summarize this kind of section because I think this is actually a massive topic that can't be covered completely within 1 hour. We've talked about free will, we've talked about the implications of structure, but I want to talk more specifically about a development that's happening now in the modern world. The common economic example is that we want to maximize our reward for the least amount of effort, but you did a study that showed that this contra freeloading is actually not exactly true. So for instance, if you give someone the task of constructing a Lego Bionicle, and there's 2 groups, and you take the Lego Bionicle, and you start disassembling it the moment that they finish it, they'll be less incentivized to do it if you just take that Lego Bionicle and hide it. So clearly the effort in the process is, I guess, very important. What does meaning mean in this context?
Yeah. So I don't know if you know, but what's the date today?
10th.
10th?
Yeah.
So I think next week sometime I have a new book coming out in Dutch on the topic of motivation. And the introduction to that book is actually a very tough chapter. So because, oh, by the way, I didn't say it, you've noticed I have half a beard. The reason is not that I lost a bet, that's what people think sometimes, but I was badly injured many years ago, and the right side of my face is, most of my body, but including the right side of my face is burned, so I don't have hair on this side. And because I write about my injury in an open way, about once a week somebody with an injury writes me. And you know, I usually have a discussion and I try to see what's going on with them. And one of those cases was a woman who found my number and called me to tell me that her friend's 2 sons just got injured very badly, and she asked me if I could go to the hospital to see them and their mother. So I went to the hospital, and they were very badly burned. And the mother asked me a very tough question. She asked me what should she tell them about their injury, and I tried to go back to my own injury, which was many years ago, and I said, I thought that for me it was about being in this very strange environment, in and out of consciousness, and not knowing what to do with the little beeps and the noises, and everything is different. And I said I wanted her to tell them what is a good signal and a bad signal in their environment. So to say, when you hear these beeps, it's actually good. And this, just to have some feeling of control over the environment, some understanding of what's going on. Anyway, I spent a few hours with her and I left. And 2 days later, I get another call from her, not a call, actually, a quick text. And she asked me, she just said, please come. And I come, and one of the kids passed away. And she asked me if to tell the other kid that his brother died. And I said, who knows, right? What's the right answer? But I said no, because I said, it was in such a tough state, right? You get drugs and hallucinations, very hard to figure out how things work. And I said, don't tell him for as long as possible until he's out of that state. Anyway, fast forward a few months, I saw the mother a few more times, and then I come to see the kid, and we spent about 2 hours together, and we talk about different things. And I feel quite good about our ability to communicate, and I was very worried emotionally about what it would feel like to go and visit him, but it was fine. And then the nurse came, and the nurse told him that he'll have a new treatment today. And I remember that treatment that she wanted to do to him today. And the kid said, "Can we do it tomorrow?" And the nurse said no. He said, "Can we do it in a few hours?" And she said no. And he said, "Can we do it just on my legs?" And the nurse said no. And anyway, he tried to negotiate, and she said no, 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 no. And as they were negotiating, I felt so bad. I had to sit and put my head between my knees and just kind of try to breathe heavily. I felt completely nauseous. And it was a moment when I understood that, you know, when I think about my experience in hospital, I thought about pain, which is of course a big part of my life, but I didn't think much about helplessness, about this fact that in hospital you have no control over where you are, over what you do, what hours, and this helplessness and this desire to negotiate and control and have some say in how the hospital takes it out. Anyway, I leave the hospital. We're still in touch, by the way, with this kid. I leave the hospital, and my thought was, why do I do this? Like, why do I do this to myself? Once or twice a week, I talk with people who had terrible injuries. They ask me for advice. It's always, in many ways, it's a miserable experience. I cry, and it's painful, and it's difficult, and it's consuming. And, you know, if you thought about human being as maximizing some momentary happiness, I'm doing the opposite. And you could say, well, maybe I just enjoy pain. No, I'm not enjoying pain. It's not good, but what is it about that, what is it about being part of these miserable moments that attracts me? And I think it is the feeling that I'm helping somebody else. And, you know, there's lots of ways to get meaning in life. The interesting thing is, meaning is rarely comes at the form of momentary joy. Right? If you think about, like, what do we usually think about what we're driven to, I think people think, you know, we want to sit on the beach drinking mojito. That's like life. That's like, you know, the ultimate goal in life is to do this. But the reality is that I think we're driven to very different things. We're driven to a sense of helping other people and overcoming obstacles and achieving things that are difficult, like, you know, people run marathons and climb mountains and do startups and research projects. The things that give us true satisfaction is very different than momentary joy, and actually usually doesn't include almost any momentary joy.
Do you think in that sense then the kind of cold definition of rationality that we've talked about is kind of at odds with the sense of a wider meaning in life?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because if you think about standard economics fits better with maximizing momentary joy. But, you know, look, sitting on a beach drinking mojito is very nice. But the whole life of that is certainly not a life worth living. And the things that give us a true sense of achievement usually comes with things that violate all the axioms of pleasure maximizers, right? They're very, very different. I mean, very few people start a business and laugh on a daily basis, right? It's mostly complex and difficult.
Unless you're a comedian.
Maybe. By the way, you know that good comedians commit suicide much more than the average?
Oh,
Actually,
Very depressed.
comedians,
didn't know that.
comedians, if you think about what they do, is they look at the underbelly of society, right? Their job is to find the funny things in human misery. So a lot of them are not that happy.
Won't become a
But that's,
comedian.
I want to ask you a slightly heavy question on this section because you do give
Up to now, they were not happy.
This
I
is
know,
a light
it's a
introduction.
really difficult one, which is because you do write about and you have given businesses some advice on how to increase meaning in the workplace, right? You've given an example, and not just with disabilities, but there are a lot of people suffering in factory settings, and you don't need to look far from an Apple factory in China where people are working day in, day out. And the question is, how can you increase meaning in a workplace like that?
Yeah, so actually, you don't know this, but we just finished a big piece of research. When we, so I have a data set, right? So usually I'm an experimentalist. This is actually research on kind of statistical research. So I have a data set of 800 companies and 80 dimensions of how they treat their employees. And the dimension could be quality of furniture. It could be quality of salary between men and women. It will be how safe people feel. So 80 companies, 80 dimensions, from 2006 until today, sampled at least once a year, sometimes more. And I basically took each of those dimensions, let's say quality of furniture, and I said, imagine that we sorted the companies from the company who treat their employees best to the companies who treat their employees worst on quality of furniture. And imagine that I did it for 2006, and I bought in the stock market the companies that were in the top 20%. And I kept them. In 2007, I got new data. Maybe one company went up, one company went down, and I kept a portfolio of the 20% companies who treat their employees best on quality of furniture, on equality of salary between them, and each of those dimensions separately. And then I could say, what is the return on each of those portfolios? And I can compare it to the S&P 500. All but one do as well or better than the S&P 500. And then I could do the same thing for the companies who mistreat their employees. All but two underperform the S&P 500. Now that's a really nice beginning. It says that if you measure almost anything that companies treat their employees on, you could do as well as the S&P on better. But some things do just a little bit better or the same, some things are much better, and some things are just the same, and some things are much worse. What are the things that matter? So I'll ask you, salary matters a lot or not?
No.
Salary doesn't matter a lot. Fairness in salary matters a great deal. Employee benefits, health benefits, retirement saving matters or not?
Yes.
No.
No.
Job titles matter or not? No. The things that matter are things like management transparency, fairness. And one of the things that were really nice is one of the things that matter the most is the answer to the question, I feel that in this company, honest mistakes are valued. Think about it. I feel that in this company, honest mistakes are valued. It means that these are companies that give people agency. You can have your own judgment, and if you make mistake, we judge your intention, not the outcome. So the things that end up mattering is autonomy, motivation, transparency, fairness, things that are hard to measure. You really need to go and do surveys with employees to get this data if you can't observe it. But for me, this is kind of like the economic proof that companies who treat their employees better could also have higher stock market return, right? So the next step is to convince companies that it's also good for them. Now, sadly, what's ethical and what's good for companies is not always the same. But the first step is to take the things that are the same and convince companies to do those things, and then we'll get to the things that are not in companies' best interest but ethical. So I do think that treating people well is incredibly important. Now let me just say, why is it not just important by becoming more important? So think about the gap between the minimum people have to do to just not get fired and the max people can do if they're really excited. If you're a student, it's the same thing, right? Think about the minimum you need to do to get by in the class and the maximum you could do if you're truly excited about what you're studying. This gap is huge, and it's growing bigger. And why is it growing bigger? Because we do things that are not visible, right? If I arrange the chairs here, you could see how I arrange the chairs. But if I sit in my office and most of my work is between my ears, how do you figure it out? So we call this goodwill, the gap between the minimum you have to do and the max you can do. What gets you goodwill? It's very hard to contract on goodwill. It's very hard to give you a bonus on goodwill. Goodwill comes from true love and passion. And because of that, I think that companies are going to be incentivized more and more to incentivize people or to ignite love and passion. And it's not easy to do. Like
But
some people have good intentions, but they don't know what to do.
But that makes sense because, you think in our everyday lives, motivations, intention, love, passion, this is what gives people meaning in their everyday interactions. So
That's right.
companies should incentivize it and encourage that in order to motivate.
That's right.
the
And
workforce.
we're really in a very privileged position from that, right? So let's say we had again a mechanical job like putting the chairs here. There's not that much extra motivation that you can put in. But when you think about the modern workplace, you could take social motivation. You can take caring about other people. You can connect people to the meaning of what they're doing. I mean, there's lots of things that we could just kind of take from society and bring into the workplace.
So we want to move on to our last section. It's on happiness, and I think you've actually already kind of answered the first question, which is in talking about life fulfillment and meaning, where does happiness fit into all of it? And what you explained earlier with short-term happiness and momentary satisfaction versus longer, broader perspective of meaning.
By the way, it's a real struggle. So it's, if you think about, like, imagine we call them happiness 1 and happiness 2. And happiness 1 is momentary happiness, and happiness 2 is the one that has meaning. What's the right ratio between the two of them? Right? What's the right ratio between drinking mojitos and doing complex, difficult things that make you cry?
You can do both at the same time. So run a marathon with a mojito in your hand.
In the side, it's a little tough. It's a little tough. But look, think to yourself, like, what do you think is the right ratio?
No clue. I'm too young.
Very tough.
We're supposed to ask you the questions. You're asking us ones we do not know.
Because maybe 2080. That's a random number out of there.
Pareto principle.
Yeah.
It worked for other things. Let's
Exactly.
put
Yeah,
it here as well.
just shoot it out.
That's a very high ratio, right? It's like a day a week, a bit more. It's a lot of mojitos.
Well, you were saying before that you don't have you have dessert once a week, so that's really restricting yourself on the momentary pleasure.
Yeah, but it's not the whole day. I mean, it's not 20. But so personally, I think I have a lot of type 2, and I haven't figured out yet what's the right amount for type 1.
I do want to ask a question specifically with millennial and I generations.
Yeah.
This is another development on the kind of just the context of happiness in the modern world, which is this idea of hedonic adaptation, which you've mentioned. It's, for instance, if I experience something very disastrous in my life, the idea is that my life will be awful, but over time I return to the same stable level of happiness. But I think something somewhat disturbing that's happening is that major depression is on the rise among all Americans from all age groups, specifically among our age groups. And why aren't we returning to a stable level of happiness?
So the things, there are things that we get used to and things we don't, right? So you move to a new house and it has this green formica or some ugly color of something, and you think this is awful. I can't imagine anybody could live like this. And in 3 months you stop seeing that. On the other hand, when you date somebody, the same little things that they were doing keep on annoying you, and they get more and more annoying. Things you thought were cute once become highly annoying later on. It's the opposite of adaptation. And it's because the ugly green color is in the background and it fades away. It's not the essence of your life, whereas the things that your significant other doing are demanding attention. And you pay attention to it and you don't get used to it, they become to signal something else. And so the question is, to what extent are the things that we adopt to and not are background or foreground? To what extent are they central to what we're doing? And if you live your life online and people are posting only good things that are happening, you have a constant reminder, and it's a new type of reminder, right? It's not green. It's like this friend is doing this amazing thing, and this friend is smiling because of this, and you can't stop paying attention to that.
It's constantly refreshing.
It's constantly demanding your attention. It's like new information. It's the same type, but it's new information, and you can't get used to that.
Would you say it's the same for anxiety as well? Because that's also on the rise. But that I would say is a different valence than depression.
Yeah. So I think all kinds of things are happening. so this is pure speculation. So Dan Buettner is a National Geographic discoverer, and he's been going around to the places where people live the longest, on the happiest, and try to understand what they're doing. And of course, they're doing lots of things at the same time, so you can't separate the two. But in all of those places, both the happy places and the people who live healthy and long, they have a lot of social time that is truly social time. And it's, if I remember correctly, it's a little bit more than 3 hours a day. And I went to one of those places, and it was in Sardinia. And you know, the men go in the morning to the fields, and then by 10 o'clock, they're in the coffee shop. And you know, they sit there and they drink coffee and they chat and so on. And they have a tremendous amount of direct social relationship, and they're not looking at their phone, and they're not distracted. And it's a very different life. Now, you could say we have depression and we have anxiety, and I don't know what's the common mechanism, but I would speculate, and this is just a speculation, that our lack of social connection, I think social connection is a big buffer. So, and we know for some things, right? So we know, for example, when you have a couple, and if the wife passes away, the good chance that the husband will die in the next year. The other way around, by the way, doesn't happen. If the man dies, doesn't do anything to women.
We're just we're too dependent.
Exactly, because usually the wife is the man's best friend, but the man is usually, wife has many other friends.
Okay. I see.
And social networks are an incredible buffer. It's a way to release stress, and it's a way to find out what other people are doing.
Just to clarify, social networks in the face-to-face sense.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
A real
Proper
social
networks.
buffer. But if you move from that to Facebook, or you know, whatever it is, and you don't share anything deep, like you know. This is not nice to ask, but you know, when was the last time you shared some sexual anxiety questions with some of your friends on social media? Doesn't happen.
No.
No.
Not that I can remember.
But you know, but if you sit, but if you sit with somebody, I mean, the odds that you could say, you know, I'm really worried about X or Y. I mean, lots of things come up. So social networks give us. And now somebody would say, oh, you know, that's not that bad, it happened to me as well. I mean, social networks are really, I mean, real.
But do you not think, in theory, the lack of face-to-face interaction could make those questions easier to ask? It doesn't work out like that, but why not?
It could, only that we have lots of social cues when we talk to each other.
And over text,
We rarely come up and say, hey, you know, things don't work, like, you know, something extreme. It usually, like, I look at your eyes, I look for some kind of thing, I'm willing to take another risk. I mean, things happen this way. You know, it's about knowing that people care. By the way, we find that medication adherence is higher for people with more social connection, which means that we take care of our own health, sometimes not just for us, but for other people as well. So if you think about this design of society, I think we found a quick way to give a low-quality substitute to real human connection. We did a study once, and we found that, what does it mean to be friends? So I picked one definition. Somebody who would drive 500 miles would spend $2,000 to bail you out of prison. That's the definition. Having coffee with somebody increases the chance that it will happen. Facebook discussion does nothing. Right? So what are we really getting in this thing? So we have a substitute, we call it friends, we do all kinds of things, but what is it really a buffer for? So, you know, that's one, I think one part of the issue.
And where does Tinder fit into all this? Because you've written and spoken a lot about Tinder. This is something which is extremely rational, I think, inherently. It's a marketplace for dating. Is that rationalization something that should be left out of relationships? Is that what the problem with Tinder is, or is it something else?
Is Tinder bad?
So, I think Tinder. Okay. So one thing that is really interesting with Tinder. How many of you have tried Tinder? Okay. By the way, those of you who haven't, I highly recommend it. You go on Tinder, you say people are wonderful. Like, where are all these wonderful people? When regularly, but on Tinder, everybody's wonderful. So one thing that happens on Tinder, sadly, is that people are, sometimes follow the economic rational agent. And what happens is that women actually make decisions, right and left, and men just right swipe everybody.
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And what it does, the men say, why should I make a decision now? It's too tough for me to make a decision. I'll just right swipe, and then if somebody contact me later, I can decide later. And that's a good strategy for each man, but for the system, it's very unproductive. Because now there's lots of women who get disappointed and either leave the system because they did match with somebody and nobody's calling them back, and the system has less accurate information, it's less matching, it's less informative. So the whole value of Tinder goes away because of men's. For each man, it's individually rational. For the whole system, it's destroying the system. So they have the super likes and they have all kinds of other things to try and mitigate this problem. So as far as I can tell from the data, Tinder is really good for initial screening. But it's not good to find real compatibility. And here's an exercise that we did. This was before Tinder, so we used a different dating website. We asked people to give us 50 names of people that they know, 25 that are really good friends of them, and 25 that are not so good friends. Not people they hate, but just not really good friends. And then we went to this website and we took all the attributes of how you describe a person, height and weight and political affiliation, all the things from that website. And we got all the 50 people to get the description with no picture. And we gave them back the description. We said, here's 50 pages. Half of them are people you said you really liked, half the people don't really like. Please sort them into two piles, the people you think you liked and the people you think you didn't like. How able were they to sort them into categories? Almost random. Why? Because at the end of the day, the description on online dating site of height and weight and political affiliation and what's your favorite color, like if you went back, imagine each of you go down to your best friend and you say, if you saw a description of that person on an online dating site, would you say, oh my goodness, that's going to be my best friend for life? No. People have lots of attributes that we don't capture in the simple description. And those are the things that make real connection. So, you need like an early screening. It's okay, but the real description there are not the things that we really need.
Let's turn to the audience, people that might have been using Tinder. If anyone has a question. No one? No questions for Mr. Ariely?
You've only
That's
got one
crazy.
chance.
That's crazy.
Well, maybe they don't want to admit that they've been on Tinder.
Right.
Somebody's
Oh,
behind
not
you.
even on Tinder. Any last concluding questions? Right there. I guess you can just shout it out too. I don't.
I think you just explained everything too well, so no one has any questions.
Yeah. Do you think that's the reason why Bumble got so huge in the US? And why did Bumble not explode here yet, even though they're dropping loads of money to try to make into, student cell phones?
Okay, so another dating app.
So Bumble is a dating app that gives more control to women, and they have had a lot of success in the US. So I'm not sure about Tinder in Europe. I've seen lots of research on Tinder in the US, but part of it is that it's kind of a market when the winner takes all, and you need to basically be able to get the critical mass to be attractive. And I'm not sure how able it is here, but it's very tough to get a critical mass. But once you get a critical mass, it's very useful to switch, but nobody wants to be the first one. Like, who wants to be the first person on Bumble? Right? It's a little lonely to do that. So I think that's the issue. But in general, you know, this tragedy with Tinder, when the men swipe way too much, is very destructive for the whole system. Yeah, so, you know, online dating, I really think we need help, by the way. We do some research in other places in the world, right? Like Africa, and you know, there's health problems and financial problems and poverty, and this is like a terrible situation. Now, we are very lucky in many ways. But the misery that we have here from dysfunctional romantic life is a real big issue. So it's certainly a market that we need to fix. But those forces don't necessarily help.
Sadly, we're running out of time, but I want to ask one last question, because I think you've given a bit of advice on meaning and happiness. For you, Mr. Ariely, would you say you found meaning and happiness?
So I think I found lots of meaning.
Yeah.
Happiness is a little tougher. You know, I'll on an average day. So just to give you kind of numbers, I travel about 300 days a year, which is quite a lot. I get about, I don't know, maybe 300 emails a day from people who ask all kinds of things.
Sorry for that, by the way.
So, you know, I'm very privileged in many ways, but I think I'm really high on the meaning side. There was a period when I thought that exercising is immoral. For me, I said, you know, I have so much to do. Like, how can I justify an hour of running when there's so much to do? I now exercise. But it's a tough trade-off between what's fun for us at the moment and what we feel is useful.
What do you think is more important? Would you rather have it heavy on the meaning side and perhaps short on the
Life full of
happiness?
meaning or a life full of happiness?
No, I think meaning is better than happiness if you had to choose to be on an extreme. But you need some of both. But it's a real struggle for everybody. I think what is the right balance, and of course when you decide to have momentary happiness, the question is, how do you actually do it in the right way? So not just doing something social, doing something with friends, you know, doing the thing with a lot of the things that give us like, let's say, type 1 happiness, they need a little bit of energy to get going. Right? It's easier to sit in front of the sofa and watch something on Netflix, but that's not really even maximizing type 1 happiness. To do that, you need also some energy to do something.
I think we've run out of time, sadly. I really wish we could talk longer to you, but of course you have
Next time.
100 other emails to also address. I'd like to ask everyone to give a really long round of applause for Mr. Ariely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.